Now that our plants have been transplanted to their final home, it's time to talk about the flowering stage of the marijuana grow process. The flowering stage is extremely important. It's when the reproductive organs begin to develop. That's when we sex the plants, like we discussed a little bit earlier. The white pistils, that's a female. Any sort of little pollen sac, nut-shaped, round seed-looking thing is a male. It's a male, the pollen sacs that pollinates the females. And like we discussed regarding Sinsemilla, males pollinate females. Females that are pollinated bring seeds, and seeds degrade the quality of the buds themselves. So this process of flowering begins with the development of the reproductive organs. That's when you're gonna make sure that you axe all your males, get them out of the garden, get them across the other side of the property, get them in the trash, whatever you want to do. But remember that the females, that's the good stuff. Females by themselves are going to produce you high quality seedless cannabis. Now that we have just our females separated aside, it's time to consider changing the photo period of our lights. We discussed earlier that the vegetative state is 18 to 20 hours of light on the plants, 4 to 6 with the lights off, no starry skies, anything of that nature. The fall flowering photo period is a bit warmer of a light. That's when we use the HPS, high pressure sodium lights, like the one that we have here in the grow box and the ones that I showed you at the beginning of this course. It's a warmer color, mimics fall, the colors of autumn, tricks the plants over into flowering, and we go into a stage of 12 hours of light on, 12 hours off. Now, if you're outside, you're gonna have to manually turn the lights off at a point in time. That means you can, pull a tarp over your cannabis crops, whether you have them in a hoop house, greenhouse, anything. You just wanna make sure that they're only getting 12 hours of light, and then they're getting 12 hours of complete darkness. That's gonna give you the best quality yields on the buds, because they're really gonna try. What happens is the females, the pistils go out, the buds are the flower. It's an unpollinated flower. And so as the female sex organs start to grow, they're trying to catch the pollen from the male plants. But since we've removed the males, they're just gonna keep growing and growing and growing, just trying, hoping to get pollinated. But since we've removed the pollen from the equation, they're just gonna grow into these nice buds that we have today that you see in the dispensaries or elsewhere. So remember, fall photo period, that's 12 on, 12 off. Very important. In addition to that, the indicas tend to flower faster than sativa. Indicas take about 6 to 8 weeks, maybe 10 weeks to flower. So once the flowering starts, it goes faster, and you want to be mindful of that. So you can grow more indica in a season than sativa, because sativa takes longer. It doesn't always take 3 months, but it can take up to 3 months. It can easily take 12 weeks or a little bit beyond. So keep that in mind when determining your growing season, especially if growing outdoors, because if all of a sudden you start to lose the light and the sativa can't finish flowering, there's not much you can do besides adding supplemental light, which can get quite costly at an outdoor setup. In addition to that, we want to keep the temperature of the growing area a little bit cooler than we did during the vegetative stage. This is fall after all, and so we want to make sure that we're recreating that. We want to bring the temperature down to around 70 degrees, maybe in the 65s. In my opinion, it tends to also make the flowers a bit more compact. They hold a bit tighter together, whether it's trying to retain a little bit of that warmth and moisture. I'm not entirely sure. But in that sense, we also want to keep the humidity down, because as these flowers start to grow, any moisture that gets in there is just, asking for bud rot, asking for a fungal infection. It's why we don't foliar feed at the flowering stage using our sprayer, as we demonstrated earlier. That being said, since I have this up here on the table, we do have some insect control here. You can use this. I have seen people spray their buds if they start to develop a little bit of mildew or anything with an antifungal, but it's a double-edged sword, because as you're spraying solution to get rid of the fungus, to combat the fungus, you're moistening the buds, you're adding chemicals, they're absorbing that. And so you can flush that out later, but at the same time, you're just adding more fuel to the fire, essentially. You might be combating the fungus for now, but over time, it's just not, it's nothing. You can't win. You want to harvest it as soon as possible once any sort of fungal infection spreads in. In that regard, since I'm over here, we have some bud candy. This is just a liquid fertilizer. This one specifically contains some water-soluble magnesium. Just follow the instructions on whichever one you have. This is another brand, Rock Resonator. It says give you heavy yields. You just shake it well in the second week of flowering as you're beginning. That's when you really want to be able to like pump some nutrients into your plants. Along with the vegetative stage, the beginning of the flowering stage is when you're going to see the most development. So that's the time to add these nutrients because your plant is craving them. That being said, as you get close to the harvest, you want to make sure that you feed and flush. I skipped over this a little bit, but we'll come back to it. Feed heavily, feed often. Don't overfeed, but make sure that your plant has every possible nutrient they could want. And again, like I've stated a couple times throughout this course, you should check your pH balance here of your soil, because if your pH isn't right, it doesn't matter what you're feeding them, the plant's not going to uptake the nutrients. So it's always good to constantly be monitoring that pH. After you feed it, a week or two, maybe 2 weeks before you're getting close to your harvest, you want to start flushing your plant, meaning you want to get all those nutrients and those fertilizers out of the plant. So you're feeding your plants just regular water. I have also seen, like with the rooting solution, either some sort of raw honey. I've heard of that one. I've personally seen molasses be used. Provides glucose for like a little extra organic boost, so those flowers can really just try and right before you cut them down. Now, really quick, back to our HPS lighting, high pressure sodium, like what we had in the grow box there. That gives that kind of warm fall photo feel to it. They're a little bit warmer on the color spectrum, whereas the metal halides are not. That's that kind of harsh, bright daylight light. So better to use the HPS over the MH always when it comes to flowering. The HPS is what we have in the box now with the plant that's flowering there. I want to come back to the feeding really quick. So the first week or two, once you've transplanted your plants in there, you want to feed them a mild nutrient solution, meaning don't get too carried away because they're in a transitionary period. They're already a little stressed from transplanting. You don't want to overstress and burn your plants. They'll continue to stretch a little bit, meaning they rise, they grow closer to the sun, they stretch, they get taller vertically during this time. And they're not vegging, but they will develop these flowers and eventually start to bloom. After 2 weeks, approaching, like I said, the end of harvest, 2 weeks, from 2 weeks into the flowering stage to 2 weeks before the harvest, that's when you want to feed heavily. But again, not overly so. You just want to make sure that you give them what they need, but not so much that you cause any sort of burn, nutrient lockout, or any extra heavy stress. Anything that's not really producing, any leaves that are kind of old, rotting away, dying, you want to get rid of those, prune those out of there. Pruning does stress the plants, but at the same time, dead leaves that are still attached to a plant are susceptible to disease and pests. So you want to find that balance of just letting your plant go, letting it develop fully, but also making sure to pluck off the dead stuff so it's not susceptible to any sort of infection. Because anything that's not producing any light that's past its point of photosynthesizing is just taking energy from the buds, because that plant is trying to keep that leaf alive when really that leaf is not good for anything anymore and might as well be removed. That way that energy can go to the flowers above it. Do anything like cut your low-hanging branches and effectively use the trellises that we were discussing earlier, the wires. That way you can keep the branches away from each other, help to control the humidity, make sure that if all your buds are compact nicely, if one of them gets rot, they're all going to get rot. If they're spread out evenly, getting good airflow and circulation, you'd be looking really good. In addition to that, once we come to about the harvest phase, 6+ weeks of the flowering stage, when the production of the bud starts to slow, you'll notice that all of a sudden they're not really getting bigger, but they're getting a little bit darker. And we're going to come to that in the harvesting stage. That's how you know the harvest is upon you. But essentially the white hairs, the pistils of the females, they go from white to they turn this reddish kind of gold brown color. And they start to shrivel up. And the fan leaves, these leaves here that provide the shade and do the photosynthesizing, they start to fade from like this kind of nice vibrant green that we have, and they just look a little sun faded. So when that starts to happen, the harvest is about to be upon us, and that's the perfect time to flush the plants, as I was saying earlier. And you flush all those fertilizers out before the harvest, 2 weeks ahead of time preferably. At that point, that's when you can do a final feed with the honey, the molasses. Just want to make sure you flush out all the salts and the minerals. Honey and molasses, those are sugars, those are carbohydrates. Those are still good to help your plant have energy to produce the buds, but it's not going to leave any sort of mineral deposits in them. If the leaves start to yellow, don't worry, because you're about to cut it all down anyway. At this point, we're focused on the flowers. We're focused on the buds. If your leaves are starting to shrivel up, die, that's the time to get rid of them. Make sure that they're not taking any extra energy from the flowering process. Once you flush your pot properly, you're good to go. You can start to cut it down, and we'll discuss that a little bit more. But it's very important that you do flush your buds, because buds that are not flushed, they just don't taste as good. They burn a little funnier, and they're harsher. They're just harsher on the lungs. You're basically inhaling the nutrients that you put in the ground into your pot plant. So all that magnesium, calcium, all that stuff, that's not what we're looking for when we, roll up a joint and look to partake. And then once again, at this stage, we just really want to be mindful. Have your sprayer at the ready, to spray the ground, pests, fungus, all that sort of thing. Once again, being very careful not to get too much liquid around the buds to prevent any rot, but at the same time, there are various pests and fungus, bacteria, and diseases that can set in this flowering stage, specifically between the first 2 weeks and the 8 weeks before harvest. That stretch, when they're just really growing, that's when you really, really, really want to pay attention. And the first sight of any sort of pest damage, you really need to diagnose it, find out exactly what it is, and follow the various protocols that there are to combat it.